Hello, everybody. I'm excited to have the opportunity to make this project and speak about one of my favorite movies, Captain Phillips. And we're not just going to be talking about the movie. We're going to be talking about two really important key concepts that the movie can help us understand. These concepts are the logistics of the global commodity circuit and uneven development. And we're also going to be explaining how this ties into local geographies. And we're going to start right here. Behind me, here, and behind you, there, is the Port of Oakland. In total, it loads and discharges over 99% of the containerized goods in Northern California. It moves over 2 million TEUs, or 20 equivalent units, shipping containers, annually. It sits as the major node that connects Oakland and the Bay Area to the larger global supply chain, or commodity circuit. If we're going to understand the global commodity circuit, or supply chain, and how it relates to our movie Captain Phillips, we're going to need to take a trip and go to the eastern coast of Africa. But first, what are supply chains? The global supply chain is a network of interconnected processes, systems, and organizations that enable the production, transportation, and delivery of goods and services worldwide. Or, to put it in more theoretical terms, capital is flowing and circulating constantly in the form of raw materials and finished goods. The mechanisms for production, i.e. labor, are moving as well, even facilitating this circulation itself through logistics. This movement has increased dramatically in scale and speed. But don't take my word for it. Take it from Captain Phillips. The competition out there. When I was starting out, you could make captain if you put your head down and did your work. But young guys coming up now, companies want things faster and cheaper. Something to consider, however, is that Captain Phillips being flown out to do this route on the eastern coast of Africa is an example of this increasing speed of circulation. Now, back to Somalia, or more specifically, Salalah. Salalah is a major port on the southern coast of Oman, a prime position within the Indian Ocean trade network. The port houses several deepwater berths and moves almost twice as many TEUs as the Port of Oakland annually. It also notably has deeper berths that can handle even bigger ships. That's right, if you thought the ships in Oakland were massive, Salalah handles ships that can take up to 24,000 TEUs, which is 33% higher capacity than the largest ships that Oakland's ports can handle. However, it's not just freight. Salalah also handles the largest tankers in the world, which transport the most valuable commodity that this region produces, oil. When looking at the shipping lanes of the world, we can see that many of them are in straight lines, as close to the coast as possible to minimize costs such as in fuel and labor. But, maybe even more importantly, they save time. In the modern world of logistics, where just-in-time production, or lean production as it's called, is the name of the game, producers don't want to sit on a large inventory. That is capital that is currently not being used and has already been invested into something that could become waste if it isn't. That is why constant streams of production that stay close to the margins of demand are incredibly important, because there is no excess to go to waste. And if everything is arriving just on time and is not getting there late, then production speed can be anticipated to be just what it needs to be in order to meet demand. Martin Danyluk of Concordia University put it eloquently when he says this: excess inventories threaten profitability on several counts. Not only do they generate unwanted storage and handling costs, they also act as prisons of value, their lifeless bodies trapping capital in an immobile and thus unproductive form. That is why these ships are getting bigger. It's to be more efficient with each individual load, to facilitate quicker turnover so that more containers are in motion. Even though massive infrastructural projects like the Suez Canal predate the concept of lean production, the Suez Canal is a prime example of closing time gaps and increasing the speed at which capital can circulate. And this brings us back to Salalah and Somalia. Salalah sits at the mouth of the Gulf of Aden, a body of water that connects to the Red Sea and thus the Suez Canal, which joins the Mediterranean Sea and the Red Sea. It is the biggest connector in the world, connecting Europe and the US, as well as other nations in the Western Hemisphere, to Asia by a route that is significantly faster than going around Africa. As such, the stretch of coastal water off of Somalia, stretching thousands of miles into the open ocean, is very busy, with over 25,000 ships passing through it every year. But why Somalia? How did it get into this position in the first place where piracy is so rampant? Well, to start, the Somali government collapsed in 1991 due to several factors. Somalia's colonial legacy fostered clan divisions which were exacerbated under the authoritarian rule of Siad Barre. Economic mismanagement, corruption, and the failed Ogaden War against Ethiopia weakened the regime, and by the 1980s, clan-based rebel movements, including the USC, gained momentum, leading to outright civil war. After the collapse of the Soviet Union, the Cold War-era foreign support from the United States stopped after Somalia was no longer considered strategically useful, and this further destabilized Barre's government. In 1991, Barre was overthrown. But factional fighting between rebel groups, fueled by clan rivalries, created a power vacuum, resulting in ongoing civil war and Somalia's collapse into anarchy. Importantly, this power vacuum enabled the corporate fishing industry to decimate the local fish population, putting many people out of work. This not only hurt subsistence practices of the local population, but it also hurt their local economies that used fish for exchange. This removal of capital from local circulation and into international circulations of capital on a much larger scale is an example of globalization and global extraction that directly takes resources away from one population and redistributes them across many markets through the global supply chain. This commercial fishing put many out of work, and many would turn to piracy, primarily in the beginning, but even now, many of the Somalis that turn to piracy like to style themselves as vigilantes and liberators of the high seas. Despite the fact that most Somalis look down upon these acts of piracy and the violence that the pirates bring, it is critical to acknowledge that the piracy is a direct response to global capitalism and the inequality that it creates within these asymmetric extractive relationships. In the movie, Captain Phillips even says that these are not the Somalis' waters, but international waters. He also makes the point that they are carrying food for starving Africans, even Somalis, which is a beneficial act that undoubtedly helps the local population that is struggling to have their basic needs met. However, the need for this foreign aid in the first place calls the overall context into question. On first glance, it seems so foolish and counterproductive to be attacking shipments of supplies that will help the Somali population. And even when we acknowledge the fact that the pirates are not thinking of the greater good when conducting what they consider to be quote-unquote just business, the fact that this aid is needed in the first place reflects deeper structural features of capitalism that put Somalia at a perpetual disadvantage. When we break it down, this land was conquered by foreign European powers in the 19th century, used as a site of extraction for its agricultural potential and raw materials, then released to figure out how to be an independent state on its own. It would need to navigate the deep ethnic divisions in an economy whose infrastructure was oriented around extraction for its previous colonial overlords. Somalia, like many newly independent African nations, was very economically dependent on foreign powers. Western countries, including former colonial powers like Italy, and institutions like the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, imposed policies that favored foreign interests and left the country dependent on loans, aid, and foreign expertise. This perpetuated an economic system that benefited outside powers and multinational corporations more than Somalia itself. The U.S., then propping up the regime to stand as a bulwark against Soviet influence until it was no longer needed, then abruptly pulled out. The government's collapse was inevitable in many ways, and the foreign aid was merely putting it on life support for as long as it made sense for U.S. interests. There is a direct link from colonial rule to the government's collapse, primarily Western multinational corporations to pillage Somalia once again and precipitate the piracy that exists today. A vicious cycle, indeed. Lastly, we're going to touch on another concept that immediately jumped out at me when I rewatched the movie. And this concept is known as uneven development. Uneven development, as the name suggests, is about flows of capital affecting different spaces unevenly. It also has to do with the temporal cycles of investment and redevelopment that are integral to the continuation of capitalism. Scholar Brett Christopher says uneven development not only occurs at a variety of different scales, but is itself intimately bound up with the production and reproduction of geographic scale. And when we look at sites of uneven development, specifically to do with logistical sites, we have this. Here in San Francisco, nestled in the southeast corner, is Hunters Point, which has largely become dilapidated and unused due to the fact that the shipping has migrated elsewhere, primarily to the Port of Oakland. Right over here, we see ships, anchored down in the bay. They're not going anywhere. They're just waiting because it doesn't make sense for them to use this site. It would cost too much to keep it going when there's another one right over there. As we can see, this is a site of significant fixed capital investment. Fixed, in this case, having two meanings. One, well, this applies less so to the ships, but the infrastructure here, such as the roads, the cranes, and the rail lines, can't move. They're inherently immobile. They're fixed in place. But it also refers to the fact that the capital has already been invested into them. You can't really remove it from it unless you turn it into something else and repurpose the capital, as is the case with these ships, these trucks, these trains. They're mobile, but the capital has already been sunk into them, and they are currently doing work to facilitate the exchange and the logistical challenges of moving all this cargo around. These trucks right here, these ships, they travel all over the world carrying these goods, and they're part of the global supply chain. But the logistical background that comes with these, such as this right here, is indispensable. And it's a major reason why this site in particular has been chosen to undertake this job. And it will remain that way because the infrastructure that facilitates it is already here. This land has been left to rot in some ways, to become fallow. These buildings are abandoned, and they're probably most notable to me for having urban explorers go and check them out and post it on their Instagram. Here, over here on this side, we can see how this uneven development has been sort of changed. I mean, despite the fact that this is a Superfund site and has largely been rated as unsafe to develop on, at least these parts, here we have brand new housing developments, some of which are below market in Section 8, but most of them are market rate housing. Now that the land has gotten so devalued, it makes sense to build on it. It's reached such a low point that the seesawing of capital, as Brett Christopher describes it, has allowed it to be profitable to use once again. And this constant changing of development to undevelopment to redevelopment is pretty integral within capitalism as a whole. And this connects more broadly on a global scale, not just within the city, but these ebbs and flows happen all across the world, and sometimes for much longer periods of time with much more severe consequences. On a global scale, however, the seesawing that Brett Christopher describes is not always guaranteed. As we've seen in Somalia and many other nations in the global south, sometimes it is too difficult for places to be developed due to their relative proximity to different sites that are already developed. Existing power structures and nation states themselves are also manipulating this situation and often become barriers. Somalia would be cheap to develop due to the space and relative lack of development that's there. But the cost of importing materials, protecting construction workers, and administering such development is prohibitively expensive in a lot of ways. So it makes more sense to simply extract resources from Somalia and other peripheral nations in a more immediate way to facilitate the production and reproduction of space where it is more likely to be profitable, such as in smaller regional ebbs and flows that we see in places like the Bay Area's aforementioned ports. In conclusion, piracy in Somalia has emerged as a response to these inequalities and serves as a form of resistance to the exploitation of Somali resources. However, it also underscores the broader issue of uneven development, where the flow of capital and resources disproportionately favors developed nations, leaving countries like Somalia underdeveloped and economically dependent. Despite its potential for growth, Somalia's development is stifled by a system that prioritizes extraction over sustainable investment. Somalia's ongoing struggles are directly tied to global capitalism and the zero-sum game that it often creates.